Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have had to evacuate through Russia or were forcibly deported there. They have experienced terrible things like the filtration camps on the borders, separation from families, cruel interrogations by Russians, and being forced to live in another country, the enemy's country, without money or documents in many cases. Left stranded and struggling to leave Russia by themselves. Some, like children, of course, do not even have the option to try to return home or get to Europe. Dinara Khalilova is a Ukrainian journalist and media communication specialist who's been reporting on aspects of the conflict in 2022. Dinara has a master's degree from the UK, which gives her a unique Ukrainian-British perspective on the conflict. She is expert at creating articles and interviewing people, skills she used to support a hard-hitting report created by Sky News on the Ukrainian families forced to say goodbye to their homes and loved ones and flee. In some cases, people were deported to Russia, and it's these tragic, harrowing issues around flight, deportation, and filtration that we'll be exploring in today's episode. Dinara, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the channel.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Well, you've heard many stories of people who have experienced this deportation and in some cases filtration, and you believe the world should know more about Russia's war crimes and the horrors that Ukrainians are enduring because of Russia's brutal war, don't you?
Yeah, sure. When I was doing my research, I was interviewing like dozens of people, and the stories that they told me, they're just terrible things they experienced when having to flee somewhere from the very like dangerous places, and then what they experienced in Russia. I think it's very important to know what Russia is doing to these people, how they are forcing Ukrainians to evacuate to Russia or through Russia, and putting them in filtration camps, interrogating them, like putting physical, psychological pressure on them. So, like in many cases, there are lots of war crimes going on, and of course we should pay attention to them and tell these stories to as much people as we can. And that's what I'm trying to do, actually.
No, it's incredibly important work. And I know that occasionally there are stories in the Western press, but for something that's happening on such an incredible scale, it's massively underreported. I mean, I've seen a figure that approximately 2 million people were deported. Do we have any accurate numbers or any real sense of how many people are involved in these crimes?
Yeah, actually, it's impossible to count like the exact number of people who are deported, because it's very difficult to understand who were deported, like forcibly deported there, who came there like having no other options, or who just went to Russia like voluntarily. And like different institutions are given different numbers. So yeah, Ukraine is giving numbers about like from 1.6 million to 2 million people. The UN just repeats Russian numbers, and actually is not indicating that not all of these people are proper refugees. Some of them were deported, forcibly displaced there. And the US State Department, I think they also announced the number according to their sources. So they said that in July, it was between 900,000 to 1.6 million. So it's very like a big range between these numbers, and it's really difficult to understand the exact number because people who are being forcibly deported there, they often don't have any like tools of communication with their relatives, people who they left in Ukraine. And actually, it's not possible yet to to realize the whole scale of this crime and the whole scale of deportations of Ukrainians to Russia.
Absolutely, and I imagine it's Russia isn't putting out accurate numbers. They're probably not recording people's identities or names accurately. We see the sheer incompetence and callous actions of the Russian government suggest that they wouldn't really care to log all those names. And I guess the Ukrainian government is not in a position to do that because in many cases, the family, especially in the case of children, it could be the parents have been separated. It could be the parents have not survived. This process is almost one that has to wait until the territories that are currently occupied are liberated, doesn't it?
Yeah, sure, because Ukrainian authorities just don't have access to these people, and often they can't communicate with them. They can't find out what's really going on, and especially if it's about children, of course.
This is it, and children have very little choice in this. And I know we're going to sort of concentrate on this quite a lot because it's probably one of the most tragic aspects of this. Many of their children were forced to flee, and they won't have documentation. Some of them won't have the phone numbers of their parents or relatives actually written down. They may even have been told that their parents gave them up or their parents didn't survive. So they may have been told some terrible stories and lies once they arrive in Russia.
Yeah, and not only they can tell these children that their parents don't want them, they refused from them, but also quite often, even when these children go to Russia with parents, but mom or dad or both parents, they don't have this documentation with themselves that proving that they are parents of this child. There are lots of cases when Russian authorities just took away these children because these parents don't have these documents with them, and they're just saying to them, it's you can't prove this is your children, and they're putting these children to special places, maybe some educational institutions or orphanages, and then they're finding them new parents, Russian parents. And actually they in May, Vladimir Putin signed a decree that simplifies obtaining this Russian citizenship for Ukrainian children. And actually he did it so that Russian people can easily adopt Ukrainian children that were forcibly taken from Ukraine. And it's going in huge scale. And actually Russian people, I think they're even being paid for this, for taking Ukrainian children. So yeah, with children, it's especially difficult because they can't make choices by themselves. They're easily coerced, and Russians are using it, and they're just telling them that now it's your new home, your family doesn't want you to be there, and often they just take Ukrainian children from shelters and some places in the territories where the active hostilities are going on. And if these children lost their parents, they just take away these children to Russia and putting them in orphanages and doing the same thing, actually.
And of course, I doubt whether they're really documenting this process. So identifying these children, tracking them down later is going to be incredibly difficult, I imagine.
yeah, it's really difficult. And now Ukrainian authorities managed to return only 98 children, according to the recent data. And of course, it's a very small, a very small number from all children that were deported to Russia. And there is no like universal formula or way to get them back. It's going on like on an individual basis, and like basically, if this child doesn't have any relatives in Ukraine, maybe they died, maybe these relatives don't know about like where this child is, it's very difficult and almost impossible to get them back, because it's always going on either through relatives or some volunteer organization, NGOs. But again, children can't do much by themselves to save themselves, so they're just staying there, and Russian authorities are just doing to them what they want to do. And they're actually doing everything um, to basically make them Russians. So they're telling them that it's their new home, this is a very good place for them. Of course, they don't allow them like learning Ukrainian language, of course, and they're like they wash their brains with propaganda and saying that like Ukrainians and Russians are basically the same, and it's just your like new home, because now it's dangerous out there, and here it's safe, and you can have like a loving family and all of this.
And of course, you know, on that two topics there, really, of language and loving families, I mean, I doubt very much that the Russian system is doing background checks on the adopting families. It wouldn't be the same standard that you would see in the West. So some of those children may end up in being relatively safe environments, even though it's still a war crime. I mean, there's no doubt that it is definitely a war crime to do that, whether those children are well cared for or not. But other children are going to end up in potentially really sort of terrible and abusive relationships with the people they're placed with. Nonetheless, even the families that give them material assistance, as you say, you know, will be discouraging them from speaking Ukrainian, learning Ukrainian, having any communication or connection about their history, culture, and identity. And that in itself is also classed as a war crime, I believe.
Yeah, sure. So they're basically trying to destroy this Ukrainian identity and to make these children think that this is like basically one nation. There is no Ukrainian nation. This is all like some nationalist stuff. And actually bringing children from the country that is in war to another country and raising them there, it's actually a sign of genocidal war. And it's one of the things that Ukraine is using to prove that Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine. And of course, it's a huge tragedy for all of these families who lost their children and don't know where they are, and for Ukraine too, because it's a lot of young people, a lot of children that potentially will not return to Ukraine, will stay in Russia, and actually will be made into Russians. And in this way, Russia is trying to solve some demographic problems. And of course, they're losing a lot of people in this war. And in some way, they're just replacing them by Ukrainian children. And of course, they're making them Russians. They're forcing them to assimilate in Russian culture. And and forget that actually they're Ukrainians, and forget about their national identity and all of this. And of course, it's much easier when it's a child. So this is a clear strategy that they're doing, and it's not like a one-off thing. So yeah, it's a huge tragedy.
And of course, for people who think that this might be, just something to do with Putin and the current regime, this is a behavior that we've seen many times in history before, and it has terrible echoes, doesn't it, of the Stalinist policies where Stalin deported populations en masse from Chechnya, from Crimea and the Crimean Tatars, and even countries within the Baltics, and then around the entire Soviet Union. This is exactly the kind of behaviors that we saw in the past being repeated in the 21st century. It's quite horrifying to think, isn't it, that this is not an aberration, that this is actually an instrument of policy that Russia has adopted generation after generation to impose its control over people within its empire.
Yeah, sure. It's not a new thing at all. And Russia was doing it for a very long time, even before Soviet regime. And they were deporting not only Ukrainians, but members of other nationalities and ethnic groups. And the first mass deportations of Ukrainians under the Soviet regime actually were in the 1930s. And they were reasoning it by saying that these people were like unreliable elements, and most often it were either social groups, like this was a thing that was called dekulakization. So these rich farmers, the Soviets called them kulaks, and they deported thousands of them into the Far East, into very distant areas of Russia, and also members of other ethnic groups, not like Russians, and of course those who were not happy with the regime actually, and who posed some threat to this regime by wanting to live in a democracy and all of this. And yeah, they were doing it like by years, by a lot of time, and it's actually a very systematic thing, and it's their strategy that they use in their imperialistic goals. It's like an essential part of Russia's repressive system, and it's not surprising that they're doing it again. But there is hope that maybe this time it would be easier to return these people to Ukraine, because now we have like more means of communication. It's easier than it was back in the 20th century. Yeah, but actually it's not surprising at all. It's just the scale is just so the scale of this war crime and the crime against humanity is just devastating, and I think we just need to do everything we can to return these people. Maybe not now, maybe after the war, but yeah, I think it's very important to continue talking about it and to remind people in the world that it's a part of Russia's regime, and it has always been like that, actually.
And of course, many of the people who've been forced to flee or physically deported, they're not necessarily going to European Russia, are they? I mean, many are being sent to very, very far-flung and remote parts of Russia, which of course will make it physically much more difficult to locate them and bring them back.
Yeah, they're doing it on purpose. They're putting people in the most distant regions of Russia, in the Far East, in Siberia, and they're doing it so that these people, so it was more difficult for them to get out from Russia. And it really works, because lots of people, when they're displacing Ukrainians to Russia, these people often don't have documents with them, because maybe they just didn't take it. Maybe these documents were just somewhere in the fire. They were destroyed during this during the hostilities, and often these people don't have enough money to try to get out from Russia, especially from these regions, because it's really expensive to move from this part of Russia to Europe. And also Ukrainian bank cards don't work there. You can't use your Ukrainian SIM card, so it's very difficult to get in touch with someone. And often Ukrainians even don't know in the first place when Russians are moving them. So like at first they're said that we are moving you to maybe Taganrog or Rostov, which are the border regions with Ukraine. And then after that, they're moving them to another train. And this train is actually going to Siberia or the Far East. And they just don't have any choice, actually. And especially when these people are in a very vulnerable state after spending months in the shelters and after experiencing such horrible things, bombings, killings of civilians, and all of this, they don't have even like moral resources to resist this Russian moves, and to say that no, we don't go there, we will find other ways, because it's really very difficult, and Russian authorities are making it the most difficult as they can, so Ukrainians stay in Russia. And actually they're telling you that you will receive some help from the government, like food or accommodation, but only if you apply for the temporary protection or the refugee status. But when a Ukrainian is applying to this thing, it's getting almost impossible for them to get out from Russia, because these documents actually limit their movements. And on the border, they're just said that you applied for refugee status, so you're staying here. And of course, Ukrainians often don't know what to do, and they sign these documents and they agree to these things. And after they're facing like a very difficult conditions to deal with, and of course, lots of them stay because they don't have really any other choice.
So on which borders is this a particular problem? Because I know this is something you wrote to me about when we were preparing this interview. And I think you mentioned that there have been issues on the Estonian border with people who have these refugee status, Russian documentation. Often they've had no other choice. And as you say, to actually unlock any kind of social services, get food, clothing, shelter, they have to. I mean, is this a problem across the entire sort of EU border, or are some countries more tolerant than others, or is it difficult to know?
Yeah, actually, I was talking about Russian authorities not letting Ukrainians through the Estonian or Latvian border. But recently, in summer, actually, I think it started because I was talking with volunteers in Russia who are helping Ukrainians to leave. So they told me that on this Estonian border, in this place called Narva, Ukrainians started to get refusals from Estonian actual authorities, and they were said that like either they don't have enough documents to enter the EU, because lots of Ukrainians are ending up in Russia without like international passport, without the foreign passport, only like the internal Ukrainian one, and or they just lost their documents at all. And they say they can say to Ukrainians some things like, you spend too much time in Russia, that's why you can stay here and you can't cross the border. So it's a really weird thing, because I don't know if there are some legal reasons like that, but yeah, it happens. But mostly it's Russian authorities who are doing really like extreme interrogations on their borders with the EU, if this is Ukrainians. And actually this filtration thing that's going on, it's going on not only in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine, but this process Ukrainians are experiencing also when they're crossing border with Russia, and when they're crossing border with Russia and EU on the Russian side. Yeah, and there were actually some cases on the border that Russian authorities were not letting lots of Ukrainians go, and they were just waiting in their car line, and there were like no decent conditions to spend so much time there. And this volunteer told me that even there were some deaths, so people just died in this line waiting for Russian authorities to let them go through the border, actually. So yeah, Ukrainians are facing like lots of obstacles in Russia in different on the different like points, and yeah, it's getting harder and harder for Ukrainians to leave Russia, actually.
And of course, this problem is going to get worse, isn't it? Because as the Ukrainian army takes more territory and Russia withdraws both its own assets, agents and troops from those territories, there will also be a movement of people. I mean, some will be lucky enough to get across the other way. And I've seen, some videos of people who are actually able to make it through the front lines into Ukrainian territory. And of course, that's incredible when that happens. But many are going to have to move the other direction, aren't they? Away from the fighting. This problem is going to get worse and worse.
Yeah, I think it's there is no like clear decision to it in the near future. And I want to tell about this cases when Ukrainians were not like forcibly deported to Russia, but when they didn't have any choice, because like often when Ukrainians were trying to leave the occupied territories to the Ukrainian side, these humanitarian columns, these car lines of people, they were just shelled at by Russians, or Russians just didn't let them go through. And of course, these people had to come back and try other ways, because they were just risking their lives trying to cross this place. And also, Russian authorities were often saying to Ukrainians that they don't have a choice to go to Ukrainian side, that the Ukrainian authorities are not organizing any evacuations actually, but it was not true. And they just told them that here some buses are waiting for you, and they will move you to a safe place. But actually, often they were not saying like where. And with these cases, I was talking to these people. Actually, I talked to a girl from Mariupol who fled Mariupol when it was like active hostilities and bombings going on with her boyfriend and her family. And they just heard from someone that you can just walk out of Mariupol and there would be some evacuation buses, or the Russian military would help to evacuate. They just went there because they didn't have any other choice. There wasn't any connection in the city. It was very difficult to find out what's really going on, what Ukrainian authorities are doing. And they just went there, they sat in this bus, and this bus moved them in this occupied territories of Donetsk region that are controlled by so-called DNR. And they went through filtration process. They were like waiting for this process for days, just living in a school, like with no living conditions at all. And then they brought them from these filtration camps, those who passed this filtration process. They brought them to Taganrog. This is a city in Russia that close to Ukrainian border. And then from there, people could just go maybe to their relatives somewhere in Russia, or apply for this temporary protection or refugee status. And from there, they would be brought to different cities and accommodated in this temporary places for Ukrainian refugees. And from there, they would just have to deal with it themselves, what to do and where to go. Yeah, so this is what it looks like, and it's not always like forcibly like putting people in the I don't know, in the tanks and moving them through the border, but it's making them think they don't have any other choice, or really like leaving them with no choice, because this way to evacuate to the Ukrainian territory is getting very dangerous, because they're shelling these places, these roads. So of course, lots of people that I talked to, they were thinking about going to Ukraine first, to Ukrainian controlled territories. They tried to do it, but they didn't manage to, and then they just had to go to Russia either by themselves, or sit in these buses organized by Russian authorities and just go somewhere they didn't know where, actually.
And of course, for many who do make it out, especially towns like Mariupol and others, those towns are not only occupied, they're also ruined. So they probably are also thinking that it's better to wait, because there's literally nowhere for them to go back to. You know, their homes may no longer exist. People who can help and support them will no longer be there. This must be going through their minds as well.
Yeah, sure, because often Ukrainians are having some relatives in Russia. That's a very common thing, actually. And of course, when they experienced all of the things, for example, in Mariupol, when they lost their homes, when they lost everything they had, when there is actually no city left, of course, they're thinking about options to stay in Russia, because they may not have money, they may not have proper documents, they may not have any other options than to stay there, and maybe with relatives that would help them, I don't know, to settle. Because, and also this very important thing, because most Ukrainians know Russian and can speak Russian, of course it's easier for them to stay there, because if they go to the EU or other countries, maybe they don't know any other languages. So of course they're afraid of this. They don't know what's waiting for them there. And I think many of them are thinking it's just a easier and safer way. But of course it's very terrible that they are put in this state that when they don't have a choice, actually. And
Absolutely.
if Russia was really evacuating people, as it says, they would give Ukrainians an option to go to Ukrainian territory. It's like
Absolutely.
a legal way. Yeah, it's a legal way to do it. And when they didn't have this choice, you can say that it's evacuation.
Mm.
Actually, it's really deportation. It's displacement. It's not evacuation at all.
And they'd make an effort, of course, to log the identities of the people. They would create organizations that tried to put them in touch with their relatives. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, the Russian effort seems to be to try to divide people, convince them that there's really no reason to get back in contact, and to put barriers in the way. Now, you mentioned that actually there's a volunteer organization in Russia, and I don't really know anything about that, who is trying to get Ukrainians back. Isn't that quite a risky activity for those Russian volunteers to do? Because I imagine, the Kremlin does not look kindly on those kind of efforts, on those civic type organizations.
Yeah, sure. It's not a safe thing to do, and there are several organizations that are helping Ukrainians to leave Russia. One of them is a very famous organization. It's called Helping to Leave, and they actually have volunteers inside of Russia who are helping Ukrainians to buy tickets on train or buses, to find accommodation, to pay for all of this. They're giving them information on how to leave Russia safely and through which borders. And there are also organizations who are helping Ukrainians who already left Russia, and they ended up, for example, in Estonia, Latvia, or Belarus, and they're helping these Ukrainians to get to the final destination. And some of these people are Russians, but they're not based in Russia, and of course, it's safer for them to do that. But lots of volunteers are actually located in Russia, and I also tried to talk to them for my journalistic research, and it was a very difficult thing to do because they are very cautious about giving their identities, or they don't know actually anyone from close to the authorities, maybe to find out about what they're doing, because there are, of course, there were already cases of detaining these people, and yeah, it's not a safe thing to do. But actually, I think personally that for Russian citizens, it's the least they can do
Yeah.
to 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 pay their responsibility for this, and um, to show in any way that you're against this war
Mm.
and you don't want this to happen.
And they're a
And
small minority, aren't they? I mean,
those Russian citizens um, who understand they're responsible for this war. Uh,
and there's a
Sorry, I
small
didn't
number
hear
of
you.
them. I mean, there's a small number of them, aren't there, only? And the majority of Russians, clearly, we see are much more inclined to flee the country rather than stay and fight or stand up and help. And of course, the risk
Yeah,
is far worse for males, isn't it? On both sides. I mean, Russian males and in fact Ukrainians who fled to Russia, they're all at risk of being pushed into the army, being pushed to fight, and in many cases, the survival rate is not very high if they're mobilized and sent. But if we focus on the Ukrainian side, the risk of the filtration and deportation process is far higher, isn't it, for men than, say, the elderly or even children, because
yeah,
there are many
sure.
cases of violent interrogation, torture, and of course, people have disappeared.
Yeah, when I talked to these people who either went through Russia to Europe or were deported, like all of them told about filtration process, and how they were going through it. And they told that women with children and elderly people are actually going like comparatively fast through this process, but men of draft age, they are always going through interrogations. And what I was told from several men from Kherson region and Donetsk regions, that they were forced to stand for up to 10 hours in a very hot weather, without water, without anything, just to wait for the line for these interrogations. And then when this Russian security services interrogated them, they were asking if they have any affiliations with Ukrainian state, Ukrainian government, Ukrainian military. They were going through all their belongings. They were looking at their phone contacts, photos, everything they had on their phones. And actually, these people told me that they have some technology that can find some files or contacts that were deleted a long time ago from this phone, actually. And if they find anything that shows their connection to Ukrainian authorities or shows their pro-Ukrainian position, these people just don't pass filtration. They are detained. They're detained either in these filtration camps, or they put from these filtration camps to actual prisons somewhere in the occupied territories or in Russia. They just Russians just take them into the captivity and often torture them and beat them up and put a lot of psychological pressure on them. And even if they don't find anything, this process is very disturbing and coercive, and they're like constantly trying to provoke these people to maybe say something in support of Ukrainian government. They actually asking, what do you think about this war? What do you think about Ukraine? They're taking all of your biometric data, and it's obviously illegal to do that, and it doesn't have any like legal reasons to do such thing. And so the goal of this filtration process is to actually to find Ukrainian men, or not only men, who are connected to the government, military, to interrogate them, maybe to get some information, and then to take them as prisoners. And all of these people who I talked to, they said that they really felt very scared going through this filtration process. And women told me that they were scared that their husbands or sons or brothers would not get out from this thing. And of course, they're put under a lot of pressure, and it can take like hours, days, actually. People can wait for this filtration process in this like special, like temporary shelters, maybe in some schools or other institutions, with really not good living conditions. And about these filtration camps, actually, there is a approximate number of filtration camps that Russians created in the occupied territories of Ukraine. It's at least 19 filtration camps. And when these people who didn't pass the filtration process, they stayed there. And actually they were some, so yeah, there were several burial sites discovered near these filtration camps. And there are reports of terrible treatment of these people, and there are some photos and videos showing that Ukrainians in these filtration camps, mostly men, they're just like sleeping on the ground, don't have like enough food, like constantly being beaten up by Russian authorities, and of course it's horrible. And this filtration thing also is very much undercovered, because it's very difficult to actually it's impossible to get access to these places, but it's also very difficult to talk to these people who are in this filtration camp, because obviously their phone are being constantly monitored and all of this. And even that when people left these filtration camps, they often don't want to talk about it because it was a very traumatic experience. And I think lots of things are just staying undercovered, like lots of things that are going on in these filtration camps, actually.
Now, you've worked with Sky News, haven't you, to try to tell some of these stories, and your journalism focuses on trying to expose these terrible crimes, but it's not getting as much coverage, I think, in the Western media as you'd expect. Do you get a sense of why that is, and how can the spotlight of media coverage be increased on what is a deeply disturbing story?
Yeah, I think there are several reasons for it not being covered enough by Western media, and I think maybe the most important is they often don't have access to such information as Ukrainian journalists too. And Russian authorities are doing everything they can to cover these crimes. And also, I think lots of Western journalists, or just like Western audiences, how to say that, they really tend to believe that these Ukrainians are going to Russia voluntarily. And some of these Russian propaganda narratives are really working. And of course, Russian media and Russian authorities are making the world to think that what they're doing is they're saving Ukrainians from the war. They're giving them safe place, and they spend a lot of resources to create this kind of propaganda content to show happy Ukrainians, happy Ukrainian children who meet these new Russian parents. And unfortunately, Russian propaganda works in some way, and some people really think that this is a very like popular like phrase to say in Ukraine, that when we are talking about people who don't want to understand what's going on, they tell that it's not so clear. There are like two sides to it. But and I think lots of Western media and people living in the Western countries, they tend to think, and they want to think, that there are there are two sides to it, and that there is no like one absolute, I don't know, truth, one right country and one wrong country. And that's why a lot of them just maybe don't want to know the truth and to look closer and to examine all of the things closer, because maybe they just don't want to believe that Russia can do such things. And I think Western media and some maybe Western organizations should listen more to Ukrainians, actually, who are the victims of this war and who are telling about what they're experiencing. And I think Ukrainians should be given more voices. And I think in this way, the Western world and the world in general would know more about Russian crimes in Ukraine, and about this horrible genocidal actually war that Russia is committing in Ukraine.
And I agree with that absolutely. I mean, even last week there were articles in the BBC and the Guardian where they used the word evacuation in relation to Kherson. And of course, Russia is evacuating its agents, its soldiers, its own collaborators, but it's not evacuating the local population. It is deporting and filtrating them. And I think there's a certain ignorance and sloppiness in Western reporting, which, as you say, whether consciously or unconsciously, will assimilate Russian propaganda narratives.
Yes, I think so too. And actually, it's very sad to see how like Western media, like biggest and most reputable media, are just repeating Russian propaganda narratives, and they're thinking actually that they're doing objective journalism because they try to show both sides. But you should be very, very critical to what Russia is saying, like everything that Russia is saying. You should doubt it and check it, like, I don't know, 5-10 times, and always mention that like most of Russian media, they're state controlled, they're propaganda media. There is very little independent media stayed in Russia, and most of them, they're not based in Russia actually. And it's really important, I think, to increase this representation of Ukrainian voices, Ukrainian media, Ukrainian journalists and organizations in the Western media field, because for really lots of years, Russian voices were heard better, and really often Russian people were invited to talk about Ukraine and Eastern Europe, and they were spreading their imperialistic views. Even Russian liberals, lots of them are spreading imperialistic views on Ukraine and other ethnic republics in Russia, for example. And it's really weird to invite someone to talk about other country, invite someone from the country aggressor, from the country who was trying to erase this nation from the world, like for a long time, and the country who is having clearly imperialistic views on Ukraine, on Ukraine's culture, on Ukraine's resistance and the reasons for this war. So yeah, I think the way to the world, for the world to know more about these things, is to let Ukrainians speak, actually.
Absolutely. I mean, it would be as absurd as asking an English nationalist to comment or talk on behalf of independent Scottish voices. I mean, put it in our own context, we can see how absurd and actually lazy and unfair that is, but somehow that doesn't get questioned when it's the sort of Moscow perspective that's been put across. I mean, Dinara, that makes the work you're doing ever so more important and critical at a time like this. I want to thank you for appearing on the channel, and I want to, wish you support in the ongoing research, interviews, and writing you're doing on this and other important topics. Slava Ukraini.
Harrowing, Slava. Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure to talk to you and to tell more about the things that I was researching, very important things about Russian war crimes in Ukraine. And I hope the world would know more about it, and the people responsible would be brought to court and punished.